Good afternoon, everybody. I have gotten a question on one of my previous videos, and I feel like I have some knowledge on the subject, so I think I would share on trauma stacks and sort of how they affect you, and for people that are killing themselves with Boneshatter, or even just using the trauma support, what might be causing it, and what possible mitigations there might be to that happening. So we'll look here at the Boneshatter gem, and specifically we're looking at a couple things on here. Primarily, now this is being just a level 20 gem. At level 20, it says you take 194 physical damage per trauma stack when you gain trauma. It says you gain one trauma the first time this attack hits an enemy. That may sound like you only get, one trauma stack, period. What it really does is if you have an attack that hits, let's say, 10 enemies, you only get one trauma stack for it. But in theory, every click of the Boneshatter button, assuming that you hit an enemy, you will gain a trauma stack. That trauma stack will immediately do the 194 damage to you, and that stack will be on your character for 6 seconds, in the case you don't have any other duration things or stuff that might be affecting it. So the idea is if you click the button once, you hit once, you take 194 damage. If you click the button a second time, you would get a second trauma stack, and since you have two stacks, you would take double that 194 damage, or the 388. And again, that's all before mitigation and those types of things. So what you're trying to balance out is effectively, the more trauma stacks you have, the more damage you do, hence the 4% more damage as well as the added physical damage. So trauma stacks are good from that perspective, but unlike other classes, by just adding more damage through, in this case, more trauma stacks, you also do increase damage to yourself. And so you either have to mitigate that through various methods where you're taking that 194 damage value and lowering it as small as possible, or you're trying to increase your regen high enough that it accounts for it. So if you're taking 194 damage per hit, and let's just say, again, very basic numbers that you're hitting once per second, you need to regen 194 life in that second. Again, assuming no mitigation and things like that. So that's sort of how it works here. What I will do is just to show very quickly kind of what that looks like. We'll just grab just a random map here. I don't want to do anything crazy, and I'm not going to finish it, so maybe not one I only have one of. Let's grab Malformation for giggles. So we'll just jump in over here and yeah, whatever. But I want to show sort of what the trauma stack looks like on the screen and kind of what you're looking for as a player, because being able to know how many stacks you're doing is something that is important. So again, you have your different icons up here. You can see I have War Banner and Determination Aura. As I do things like put down, again, my War Chief totems, you'll see I'm getting the War Chief buff. If I do my Protector totems, I get the Protector buff. And that adds attack speed, attack damage, etc. If I do Ancestral Cry, that doesn't actually show up on there as well, but it is currently affecting my character. Berserk, if I had any rage, would show up as well. Blood Rage, you can see, gets a buff there as well. So whatever you do will add additional icons to your screen, and the one we're looking for is going to be the trauma stacks. And as we hit mobs, you'll see right here this little axe, it says trauma, and you can see it counting down that 6-second timer. Now I have other things, flats, etc., that are showing up, but in this case the trauma stacks are what we're more curious about. And the not so many more mobs we hit at a time, but the more mobs we hit in general, or the more swings we take in that 6-second period, is really the piece that we're curious about. You can see here I'm up to 4 trauma stacks, which obviously is not super high, but it's because it's based on hitting and not based on the damage you're doing. The whole idea is attack speed and things like that help, which is where, again, our Protector totems come in, give you more attack speed. It's where Blood Rage comes in, because again, giving you more attack speed. And so all those things make it easier to gain a greater number of trauma stacks. I was hoping to find like an Essence mob or something that would take a little bit more to kill. Or I guess in here we'll have these go for a little bit. And you can see I'm up to now 14 trauma stacks, 15. And obviously the longer the fight goes, the more you're hitting, the more that helps. We're up to 16 stacks. I'm a person who can't not pick up loot, so I apologize for that. and effectively those stacks are what increase my damage. So if we look here, I do have a little bit of rage. Try not to die. Let's try to get out of here real quick. Um, as things start to fall off here, hopefully rage will go all the way down. My base damage, and again, this is not actual numbers, but to see, you can see the sort of upper part of the screen shows 108,000 DPS. The only reason I want to show you that is because in comparison, as I get some trauma stacks here, so this will work. We have life cannot be leached. That's always a little scarier. Let's hope that that doesn't do anything too bad to me. Let's see if we can get some trauma stacks going here. There we go. So we have 7 trauma stacks, and you can see here we're at 251,000 DPS. Again, you can see it dropping as the trauma stacks and other things fall off. So that's a combination of that. It's a combination of a lot of things that are all sort of throwing some benefits to getting increased damage, but trauma stacks being part of it. That's really all I wanted to show from there. But I wanted to show in POE sort of what that means and what you can kind of do to help, especially if you're dying from those trauma stacks. So the idea here, we'll go into our configuration, and one of the things that we have here, and this kind of shows the way armor and everything else works, which I think is important. This is, I have Guardian Pinnacle boss selected, doesn't really matter, but these are the sort of information of the being hit by damage. And so what we're going to do here is we are going to get rid of our crit. Let's see if I can. I guess maybe I can't. Maybe if I change it to no. I guess it's a base crit. I can't change it. Oh, there we go. Just have to use, I guess, that and not type it. It's kind of a pain. But if we come in here and we put 194, so that is effectively the damage that I'm taking, sort of the base damage I'm taking from a hit. Now I have rage here, I have trauma stacks, I have all that stuff, so there are things that are going to be impacting that. But if you come over here to calcs, you can see that my base, that enemy damage is 194. Again, same idea, it's not enemy damage, it's coming from the trauma stacks. But currently, and I'll talk about physical taken as a little bit in a second, but effectively of that 194, I take 157 as physical, I take 11.5 as lightning, and 25 as fire. And that is effectively no mitigation, that is just purely the physical taken as, kind of splitting my damage apart. Now, of that 157, we have effectively things like Berserk, which is in here, and mitigating some damage. We have fortification, we have armor, things like that, and that effectively drops this 157 down to 10 damage, which is obviously a significant decrease. That's great, and that's what we want to see. When I have, in this case, and this is everything class, etc., 74,000 armor, that mitigates obviously a big chunk of it, which is great. It takes them to 10 damage. Now that is a single stack. Now to show this is being affected by things, if I go over here to Berserk, now Berserk does a reduction in damage that you take. And so if I turn off Berserk, remember we were taking 10 damage, I go back to my calcs here, I can now see I'm now taking 12.5 damage. So again, that is giving me some amount of mitigation. I come to my flasks and I turn off, let's see, whichever wants to give me armor. So I get armor from my sulfur and I get armor from my granite. Again, go back to my calcs, and that goes up from 12.56 to 12.7. Not significant. Again, we're talking pretty small numbers at this current state. So definitely impactful. Now, what happens, and this is where things like armor and things are effective but become less effective, is that the size of the hit that you take effectively is inversely proportional to the armor that you have. So if you take a larger hit, the effectiveness of the armor goes down. So again, turn that stuff off, my armor's dropped to 54,000. It still shows 90%, but that's based on the size of the hit. So if I came over here to my config and just for giggles decided to put in a, say 15,000 damage hit, you can see my armor mitigation has dropped to 75%. And that's what happens when you look at bosses and things, where you may say, oh, I have 90% mitigation with 20,000 armor, but as the size of the hit goes up, that mitigation goes down and becomes less effective. That is impacted by trauma stacks, because it's not 10 trauma stacks is not 10 hits of 194. 10 trauma stacks is one hit of 1940. So if you had 10 trauma stacks, again, instead of 194, you would have 1940. Again, our armor is still, at this point, plenty to counter that. And you can see here now our numbers, again, modify again. We're now taking 1571, which drops to 125. Again, 125 damage doesn't sound like a lot. Again, you saw I was up to 15 stacks on trash, on a boss. I can tell from personal experience that without having everything stacked, totems, blood rage, berserk, etc., I usually am around up to about 20 stacks. I can get up to 26, almost 30 otherwise. And that's one thing to think about when you're looking at your DPS. That number of trauma stacks that you set here is very impactful in sort of how much damage you do. If you're doing, as you saw, I was against the not the essence guy, well, the essence guy even, let's say 15 stacks, I'm at 2 million DPS. If I said, oh no, I'm really strong, I'm doing 26 trauma stacks, now it's 2.5 million. So those things obviously have big impacts. Same thing when you start adding in, oh yeah, I had berserk on 2, now I'm doing 3.7 million. It all adds up in potentially ways that are not necessarily always indicative of what you're actually able to put out on a sustained rate. So but what I wanted to do here, I'm not worried about that so much, but if we said 20 trauma stacks, which I think is a reasonable level for a character sort of my level, we'd be looking at effectively, double that. So we'd be looking at 388, and obviously one more 0 for 20, and that's sort of the damage I'd be taking. Again, I'll actually come here, I'm going to turn off berserk, just because that's not always up. Molten Shell does come into the calculation, but it comes in a little bit later, but we can turn that off as well. And those should be the primary things that are doing damage to me from that perspective. But we go to our calcs and we can see now I'm taking 251 damage, and again, this is per hit. So this is where trauma can become good and bad. The faster you attack, which is why attack speed is such a strong metric for Boneshatter, the more hits, the more trauma stacks you build, because again, you have that 6-second window. So the more hits in that 6-second window, the more trauma stacks you get, the more damage you do with each of those hits. Also, inversely, the more damage you do to yourself. And while that 251 doesn't sound like a lot, if we come over here, and this is just obviously my specific character, and we say, okay, I have whatever, 251 damage, and we say, well, my attacks per second, this is again without having berserk up, so it's less than it could be, so it's that times 4.65. That's 1167 damage per second that I'm taking, that I'm doing to myself. And that's, again, that's after mitigation. That's, again, from this 3142, down to 251, it adds up very quickly. And as your attack speed goes up, this not being a super high attack speed, it's definitely going to be impactful to effectively your survivability. So I have 1167. This is currently counting that I have blood rage up, which is why if you come here and you look at my life regen, it's 712, but my degen is 111. That's based on what blood rage is doing, and so net light recovery is only 601. And so again, if this is what I'm taking for those 20 trauma stacks per second, and I subtract my 601, that's 566 damage per second that I'm taking, that I'm not handling in any way. So my health will drop 566 damage, per second, unless I do something about it. Again, Slayers are sort of the king of leech, but obviously we build some leech in as well into our characters, and that leech amount obviously is how I cover and don't start losing health at that point. So again, I have Carnage Heart. Carnage Heart is a great, very cheap amulet. I just haven't honestly found anything better that has everything this has, which is primarily, it has a lot of leech, it has resistances, and it has attributes. All three are just good things to have, attributes, especially with the tattoos this league. So having that extra, the leech, is very helpful. The Tanawahi gloves, again, sort of one of the staple things for our class that again, not super expensive builds. Again, has that attack damage 2.66%. That helps as well. We'll also have some things on the tree. So I've done a little bit more on this wheel. A lot of people do just this one point. I've gone a little bit farther. So I get some leech there. I'm sure I have it in another place or two here. I have some mana leech over here. But the idea is that I'm using leech to help cover that deficit of 566 damage per second that I'm not getting currently. So if you are doing effectively killing yourself through trauma stacks, and assuming it's not other damage and degens that are hurting you, it's that 566 we talked about that is causing it. So the ways to fix that, there are a couple things, and one that I like a lot, as we talked about with the size of the attack changing effectively how effective armor is. One of the very powerful things you can do as a Juggernaut is to split that damage, because when we take in our Ascendancy, which is over here, we have this node, which is one of the strongest nodes for defense available in the game, that says 8% of our armor applies to fire, cold, lightning damage taken. So if we can convert that physical damage to fire, cold, or lightning, we're obviously applying armor both at the physical level, we're also going to be applying it to these things as well. And while that may sound, well, wait a minute, if my armor is 100% applied to physical versus only 8% to this, that seems not as good. But again, because we're taking that initial hit of, let's say, 15,000, if we can split out some of that into fire and cold, now my initial hit is less, making my armor more effective, and that secondary hit that's going against the fire, cold, or lightning is also smaller, again making that armor more effective. So the sort of more buckets you can break that damage up into becomes very helpful. Very easy ways to do that. There are, from Betrayal, you have a body armor enchant that does 6%. I think it can do, it's a range, but I think it's 5 to 7% maybe, or 5 to 6%, I don't remember exactly. Physical taken as fire and lightning, so that's 12% of physical damage that gets shifted, and again, by splitting it makes it armor more effective. There's a helm enchant, again 7% taken as fire. There's also, and I don't remember which of it is, but there's an explicit that does it as well, or implicit, sorry, that you can get from the Exarch and whatever currency, that will do that. So any kind of physical damage taken as can definitely help. If you're using a purity of fire or something, there are Watcher's Eyes that affect it. So even one of the more common chess pieces that a lot of people like, the lightning coil, is known for that big conversion of physical to something else, and again improves the effectiveness of armor. You can all see on my chest here, and it may be easier just to go to the game because it's a little bit bigger when I look at some of the stuff, but I have additional physical damage reduction. Again, 6% doesn't seem like a lot, it all adds up, and that 6% is not scaled as armor scales. So when armor becomes less effective, the size of the damage of the hit, that 6% flat physical damage reduction is the same all the time and doesn't change. Having that determination or effect, again, more armor makes a little bit, again, those hits a little bit smaller. Granite Flask, again, armor from the flask as well as armor during the effect. Rolled this one, I'm pretty happy with how it came out. Again, another helpful level to that. There are other things like Defiance Banner that you could run instead of maybe War Banner that will again lower that side. So those are all things you can do to help effectively mitigate the damage coming in. And so when you're looking at it from the POB side, it's effectively taking this 251 number, which, as you see, grows significantly when you start applying it by second, and it basically turns that number into a smaller number. So that's one method. The other method, obviously, is increasing your regen. So part of it is just me and my playstyle, but there's this regen wheel here that 2.6% and 1.8% is a decent amount. 15% increased regen again goes on to any flat you have. I was taking the flat 50 here. That all is what adds up to get me this life regen that I have. So having those in our Ascendancy, we have the 40% life regen rate. So things like that definitely help effectively keep that regen going. And that helps again mitigate some of that. Again, like we said, there's also the leech options. There's quite a few leech nodes that are on here. If you're looking for them, you can just search in POB. and see, we have the leech nodes over here, we have the wheel down here, we have the wheel here. So there's lots of options that are actually very close, and can help us get there. So again, some of these things are not necessarily, fully on endgame. Like, I don't want to go add every leech node necessarily, because I could be putting into, damage nodes or onslaught or things like that. So it's trying to balance it out, and this is really, I'm killing myself from trauma stacks, so how do I mitigate that? There are some other options that you can do, which are somewhat simple, from the perspective of even the things we're using. So, Blood Rage. Blood Rage does straight damage to myself, so it's lowering that overall regen I have effectively. So by not using Blood Rage, I could potentially be, not taking as much damage, and that would help. It also has the fact that I have increased attack speed. That attack speed is making me hit more often, more trauma stacks, more damage coming in. Now again, more damage going out means the mob dies faster, and that's a win as well. There's also physical damage leeches life on here, which again also helps that regen. So again, it's figuring out the balance that works for you. Same thing, the Central Protector Totem is just flat more attack speed. Again, this is only if you're killing yourself, but if you're killing yourself, again, how do you handle that? Again, more attack speed may not be the answer. And by having more attack speed, you're doing more damage to yourself. Again, hitting more and more damage out, more leeching. So it's a balance both ways. But these are things that you can do to potentially, if you're killing yourself, and you can't go get new gear or get a new enchant or things like that, maybe don't use Ancestral Protector and see if that helps. Again, may or may not, and again, it's all based on how much leech you have versus everything else, but that can be impactful. Even the speed of your weapon, you can see this is 1.72 attacks per second, and again, a faster weapon is going to hit, in theory, faster, more trauma stacks. Again, while that's also more leech, it's also going to do more damage to you as well. So having a slower weapon that does potentially more damage, so if you had similar DPS, but more damage, and again a lower attack speed, that might get you to a similar point, again, as a workaround. Obviously the end goal of Boneshatter is you want to keep increasing your overall DPS, which it means increasing your trauma stacks. And if you go look at some of the builds that are out there, you'll see a lot of them actually, when they're 6-link, they'll drop things like melee physical, and they will put in, or they'll drop plus combat, or they won't even use impale, and they'll put in increased duration. The increased duration is purely to increase the duration of these trauma stacks. The idea being, if you can keep your trauma stacks on longer, you can gain more of those trauma stacks, and as a result, you're doing more damage. And again, we saw that when we were looking at our tooltip damage, just from those few stacks we had. That's where all your scaling comes from. So obviously the end goal is to increase trauma stacks, thus increasing our damage and kill things faster. But if you're killing yourself, obviously you need to not want to die for that to happen as well. So that's sort of my quick and dirty version of this. It's probably not as quick as I would have wanted, but hopefully helpful in some ways. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. You can message me in game. I did put a kind of a written explanation in one of my other videos, but I thought this might be helpful. Also trying some new stuff with audio to hopefully improve the quality of that, so it's not quite so awful, and hopefully this will work. Again, thank you for watching.